Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm actually going to start off reading a quote. To create loving men, we must love males. Loving maleness is different from praising and rewarding males for living up to sexist-defined notions of male identity. Their value is always determined by what they do. In an anti-patriarchal culture, males do not have to prove their value and worth. They know from birth that simply being gives them value, the right to be cherished and loved. And that's Bell Hooks. And she wrote a book called The Will to Change. So instead of talking about attachment, because that could be a whole week-long or semester-long program, I'm just going to show some of the ways that as men we detach and we disconnect. And so men are 4 times more likely to take their own lives. There's over a million men in prison, which is about 13 to 1 ratio. And over half of these men have children, and also over half are in there for violent crime. 40%, this is a study done in the UK, about 40% of men have never talked to someone about their mental health. And that includes family and friends. That also includes healthcare workers or providers. This was a study in the US, but they're finding that young boys are about a grade level behind developmentally by the age of 6 or 7. And this is some of the things that have started to happen is that in more affluent communities, they're actually holding boys back so that there won't be as much of a difference. There's also some studies that have shown boys to be more sensitive to environmental changes. And so in places like school, when you're transitioning to classroom, away from home, away from your caregivers, there's more possibility for higher emotionality. And then there's another study that kind of broke my heart that showed boys at the age of 2 are receiving about 50% less of affectionate touch. And this is different than like physical touch as a whole, because there was more touch when it involved play, but less when it involved like a nurturing or affectionate presence. And right now there's almost 18 million kids in the US living without a biological step or adoptive father in the household, which is like 2.5 New York cities. So if the problem is disconnection and detachment, then the solution, the way forward, is attachment, relationship, connection, and intimacy. This is from a mentor of mine. So contact over time creates connection. Connection over time creates relationship. Relationship over time creates intimacy. And this relationship is the core of therapy, because what is wounded in relationship can only be healed in relationship. And another piece that goes along with this that is part of attachment is going through a hard time with a caregiver, with a loved one, and coming out the other side. So over time, over these experiences, over these challenges, we begin to develop like actually a predictability and a consistency. It's like, okay, I can actually really go through something and I know on some level someone will be there. And this creates healthy attachment. And I'm talking about attachment here as also just the foundation for all of our relationships for the rest of our lives. And that includes relationship to self, it includes relationship to other people, it includes relationship to our environment and to spirit. So all of these pieces are relationship. So, polyvagal. Polyvagal theory says that it is our biological and evolutionary imperative to connect with other people. We come into the world and we need people there for us. We need caregivers who can attune and, again, go through a hard time with us. And they break it down between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, and the parasympathetic is responsible for social engagement. So when we do feel joyful and connected, and able to be present. But parasympathetic is also responsible for freeze, and so shut down and collapse and dissociation. And so all of this information is coming from the body. And there are three kind of founding principles of polyvagal. The first is neuroception. And this is the idea that 80% of the information we're getting is coming from this unconscious process in our nervous system. And the nervous system is beginning to develop around 6 weeks when you're in the womb. So from that time forward, you're starting to learn like what is safe and what is not safe, and who is safe and who is not safe. And only about 20% is going the other way. And this slide is great, and they said inconscious instead of unconscious. The second principle is hierarchy. So we get all this information, our nervous system kind of absorbs it, and then we go into one of these states. And I'm going to start down here, because this is the sweet spot, and this is where we want to learn to be more. And this is where we feel able to share joy, able to connect with loved ones or with strangers. We're able to orient to our surroundings, so there's a lot of awareness, and we can feel grounded, like all the while. And this is the ventral vagal. As our arousal or activation increases, we go into fight or flight. And so in the nervous system, this is when we're panicky, when we're afraid or angry. And it's also, we still have some agency. Like we can do something with this level of arousal. And then that leads into the dorsal, which is, I can't do anything. Actually, the best thing for me to do right now is to completely shut down. And you have things like dissociation, hopelessness. Your body is kind of preparing for death here. So these are the ways that this neuroception is creating either a sense of safety or a sense of threat. And this is how it's showing up. The third principle is co-regulation. And this is me. Jake, I think, is actually on video here. And that's Jacob, and that's my oldest brother, Caleb. And co-regulation is so foundational for how we are raised. This is like that constant checking in with the infant to assess whether they're hungry, are they thirsty, are they cold, did something just brush their foot? Like it's this ongoing feedback loop, trying to provide a sense of safety. And one of the huge pieces here is that we cannot self-regulate until we learn how to co-regulate. So we need other people when we come into the world. We need connection. And if we don't have a caregiver who can stay attuned and actually regulate themselves, then our foundation for relationship is kind of teetering. We're on a faulty foundation. This brings me into men's groups. And when I'm talking about men's groups here, I'm talking about ongoing groups that are gathering with some intention and some structure. And one of the biggest intentions is just trying to talk about feelings and trying to feel the feelings. So just trying to connect with what's happening in the body and allow it to be there. And then alongside polyvagal, creating that safety in the nervous system. So how can we co-regulate? And this really gets it into the body. And I don't think this is gender specific, but going through a hard time together, a lot of men, there's been a lot of studies on this, they don't have people that they can go to when something comes up in their lives, whether it's a loss or just feeling depressed or just a challenging time. So having a space to go, and even just showing up, you can begin to co-regulate, and your nervous system responds. Over time, because attachment happens over time in groups, we can also build connection and build intimacy. and have kind of one foot in the social engagement. And I think a lot of kind of the violent behavior that happens in the world is because there's no foot in social engagement and connection and safety. And then this last, I just added in some big emotions here, and this idea that boys are more sensitive and simultaneously socialized to cut off. Like the phrase "be a man" is almost synonymous with like don't feel anything, and anger is maybe the exception to that. And so where can the full expression of this energy go? They're not a lot of places. And so there's this potential, there's this possibility for that full expression to happen here. And I think it's interesting to see how much more somatic, focused, or somatic or holistic practices are coming in, again, because attachment is like a lot of it's nonverbal. So how can we get it into the body and recreate the way that we're being in relationship? And that brings me to horses. Horses don't have a prefrontal cortex. Humans, started to develop their prefrontal cortex thousands and thousands of years ago. And one thing that happens up here is our creativity and also our stories. So we can create stories about people, stories about ourselves. Horses don't hold that, so they don't have judgments about us, they don't have the implicit biases. They're not remembering, they're not holding a grudge. They actually have a really strong memory, but they're not carrying it into the present moment. They're just tuning into you. They're also herd animals, which, again, this is like a we. It's like they survived because they were tuned in to the larger group and to the herd. They're also prey animals, which means they're just so tuned into threat and safety. So this is that polyvagal element of this horse is just so tuned in to the environment. And we come in and we become part of the herd. And they're just in the here and now. So whatever is coming up for you, they just tune into and they can help co-regulate. They also have a lot of really cool regulating behaviors, including yawning and horse lips. Like if you ever work with horses and something big comes up, afterwards they'll often roll on the ground or do a full body kind of shake or run off or do a little kick. They just move the energy. Whereas humans, we don't always have that opportunity to get dysregulated and then move it. I want to add here too, because they're prey animals and because I am talking about men's attachment, a lot of women have moved through the world at one point in their lives as prey. And so as men, who are often the biggest people in the room, we're not the biggest with horses. And the horses don't have to feel like prey if we don't go in as predators. So polyvagal applied, if you imagine the size of a caregiver to the size of an infant, it's kind of similar with a horse to a human. So you have this larger nervous system that doesn't have a story about you and it's non-judgmental. So you have a space where you can co-regulate. And because boys are also less able to talk about their emotions, so they're developmentally behind in schools, but also less aware of what's happening inside of them. And with horses, you don't necessarily need to speak. It can be an embodied experience. Groups have the same capacity. It's here's a group of 10 people, 12 people. As a collective nervous system, we have an opportunity to move someone's energy. This is part of the magic to me too. I've experienced this several times where the energy is honed or harnessed to allow some really deep things to move. How am I doing on time? Cruising through here. I went a lot faster than I had prepared. But I want to leave here and I want to make a plea around the phrase toxic masculinity, the toxic masculinity. And when we attach toxic to any identity, it creates an othering. It creates a lot of shame, a lot of defensiveness as well, and often a very fragile nervous system. And I think masculinity in a lot of ways is a much more fragile gender role than femininity. And I think there's a lot of young men who have heard this, and there's some felt sense of like something's wrong with me. And it is causing like a huge, really unhealthy, or what I would call immature masculine movement, including people like Andrew Tate, who was like the number 3 or 4 Googled term a couple years ago, and is extremely misogynistic. And so to start thinking about it as immature, if this is an attachment wound, if this is how they learned how to be in a relationship, this is not an inherent fault. It is something that they've learned, and now we can also hopefully relearn through groups with horses how to be in a relationship and how to make contact and how to create intimacy and safety. And these are a couple of the books that I found really impactful. The Will to Change by Bell Hooks, Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, who has done a lot of research on other areas where boys and men have fallen behind in society. And then I Don't Want to Talk About It was written about 20 so years ago. And one thing I didn't mention, Terence Real talks about covert depression as being a big problem with men. And this is where they don't know how to talk about what's going on. They don't even know what's going on. So how to make that covert depression overt, so bring it into a level of awareness, and then be able to work with it. And in my mind, that covert depression is another form of like freeze, functional freeze. So moving through the world, being productive, getting stuff done, but inside there's something that's frozen. So how do we thaw that? How do we allow space for the energy to move? And I'm going to wrap up there. Yeah, thank you so much. Any comments or questions or reflections or anything? I feel like maybe a lot of us here have done so much work around this that is like so much information, then how to bring it down. So yeah, I feel like I went on like 1,000 different tangents with this.
I feel like you didn't.